Today is February 12th, 2007. My name is Amy Laity. We are at the Genoa Branch Library in Genoa, Ohio. And as part of the library's oral history project, Northwest Ohio Narratives, I'm going to be speaking to Jim Blum, who's going to tell us about the life of Victoria Cataract, the last Chippewa Indian living in Ottawa County. Mr. James Blum, or Jim, is going to share his research on the life of Victoria Cataract. First of all, can you tell us who Victoria was?
Well, she was a Native American Indian, a Chippewa of the Ottawa tribe, and she was the last full-blooded Native American Indian in Ottawa County and probably in northwestern Ohio. And she was a basket maker. She made baskets for trade. And she was pretty famous in her own lifetime, and she's still famous today. And I really enjoyed doing research on her. I started back when I was in high school in the 1950s, and my parents moved out across from Chippewa Golf Course in 1949 and built a house. And I caddied and worked in the pro shop over there when I was in high school, and I was always curious about why the golf course was named Chippewa. And besides that, there's a road north of where I live called the Reservation Line Road, or the Indian Trail, as the old timers called it. And I thought, gee, there has to be something to do with Indians living around here.
Yeah, so there was a reservation then in the Catas area?
Yes, it actually, there was a line that extended from the Maumee Bay clear into Lake Township Cemetery. And this road is on the western end of it. And it was called the Ottawa Reserve way back in the 1830s. Mm-hmm. And of course, all that land was taken away from the Indians, or they sold it for pennies on the dollar.
Were there some other reservations in the area too?
Not that I know of.
Okay.
There probably were more reservations, but this is the only one that I know of. So that possibly was the reason that Victoria came out this way.
So the Chippewas were part of the Ottawa tribe?
Right, they're
then?
a branch of the Ottawa tribe, as I understand it. Mm-hmm. And
what's the preferred spelling of her name? The Cataract.
Cadaract. Okay. There's several versions. It's really a French name. Cataract is the correct French name for her last name. And but it's been butchered pretty well over the years, and a lot of people write it down the way it sounds. But the Indians did not, especially her, did not read or write English, so she couldn't say whether it was correct or not.
What's the first accurate record of her birth? I know there's.
Well, she claimed that she was born. She was 100 years old, and that she remembered the Indians and the British going through her camp, which was in Toledo around Ironville during the War of 1812 to Fort Meigs. But I don't think that was really accurate, because in the 1900 census I found that she stated that she was born in 1828 in February, which makes more sense because her children that we know that she had the two children were born in 1864 and 1868 to 1870, and she would have been out of her childbearing years if she was born in 1810 or before that. She probably remembered her mother saying that she remembered Indians going through. That would have been more apropos.
Mm-hmm. I understand that she claimed to be descended from a chief?
Yes, according to the records, her grandfather was an Indian chief that owned a lot of land along Presque Isle in the Maumee River area, and her mother actually, her true father died when she was real young, and her mother remarried to Alexis Navarre, who was the older brother of Peter Navarre, so she was related to that family. And her mother married in 1830, so that would have meant she was probably only 2 years old, at that time.
Can you explain who Peter Navarre was, the Navarre brothers?
Well, he was the most famous of all the Navarre brothers. He was a hero in the War of 1812, and he was a scout for General William Henry Harrison at Fort Meigs. He ran back and forth between the fort and Lake Erie, where Commodore Perry was, running messages back and forth. And he was a true hero of the War of 1812, but a lot of people don't know that some of his brothers served in the War of 1812, including Alexis Navarre, Victoria's stepdad.
Is there any record of her early life?
Not that we've been able to find. The big source I had was in the Toledo Blade in 1914 and 15. There were two big articles appeared on her, and evidently I think the reporter from the Blade that came out to interview her was George Pearson, who Pearson Park was named after. He was the editor for East Toledo at that time, and I think he probably interviewed her. And so most of what I have on her early life came from that article, and all it says is she was born south of Ironville in East Toledo. So that's where probably an Indian camp was at that particular time. And I don't know how she got out to Ottawa County. I first found her in the census of 1880 and also in 1900 and 1910. But it's possible that Mr. Taylor, Thad Taylor, the farm that she lived on in the log cabin, perhaps that her husband was doing work for him. And this log cabin was actually pretty old. It probably belonged to one of the first settlers in the area, and it could have been sitting empty, and it was a good place for her to stay in.
So the first record of her in Ottawa County is the 1880s.
Right, right. It's possible there could be more information out there. I did find some cataracts in 1840 in the census of Carroll Township in Ottawa County. But and this person's name was Peter Cataract, but I have not been able to find out how he fits in. Mm-hmm. He had several children, and one was in the Civil War, but he spelled it a different way with a couple of R's on the.
There were quite a few French settlers in the Carroll Township area, weren't there?
Right. Yes, very French there, and of course around Detroit too. That was all French, a French trading post originally.
Mm-hmm. So you assuming that Victoria's husband was also a French trapper, trader?
This article in the Blade, he was half French, so I don't know what that meant. He was half Indian and half French, I would suppose so. But he died when the children were very young, I'd say probably around a little after 1870. That's when her second child was born. So she was a widow most of her life. She had to make her own living, and she did that by selling baskets, of course. And I would really like to know how much she charged for them. I imagine she didn't get very much for them back in those days.
What did she make the baskets out of?
Well, it was a tradition that was handed down by Indian ladies to their daughters. It's a tradition that's carried on for many, many generations, and they would take ash tree saplings, and cut them and peel different layers of wood off, just like an onion, and then wet them so they were pliable, and then they'd make them into these baskets. And it's amazing all the different baskets that she made that we know about, and you just wonder where she got the plans for them. How it evidently would show up in her head, and she'd say, well, now I'm going to make one like this. And
put a different design in there.
All different designs and beautiful colors where she used the different things from weeds, all kinds of colorations that she'd find in the area, that couldn't be bought. Dyes from various berries, and it's. I just wish I could go back in time and interview her and see exactly, how she lived and get a complete picture of her life. But that'll never happen. We just have to take these paper trails as they come up, and just when I think I can't find any more on her, something pops up.
You mentioned Ironville. Was that a section of East Toledo, or?
Yes, it was over in the industrial part. I guess they called it that later because Interlake Iron was over there and a lot of the heavy industries. But she actually was born south of that, so I think there was probably an Indian camp there, or there had to be, where she, was born and raised. But the census record of 1900 said that she was born in Ohio. So, and also her parents were born in Ohio, so they evidently were living around this area for a long time, especially along the Maumee River and Maumee Bay. That was a big Indian settlement in the early days, and because of the transportation with the Black Swamp here, people just couldn't go over land. They had to use the rivers for their highways. And so the Indians lived on the rivers, and they grew their corn and stuff right along the rivers, and they had water for irrigation, and they were pretty self-sufficient till the whites drove them all out.
When were most of the Native Americans removed from this area?
Well, unfortunately, it happened in 1830. Our seventh president, Andrew Jackson, who was a hero at New Orleans in the War of 1812, was not a hero to the Indians because he got the famous Indian Removal Act passed in Washington. And what it meant was that the Indians east of the Mississippi River were sent out to reservations or states on the western side of the Mississippi, like Oklahoma, Kansas, Arkansas primarily. And because of the mass settlement of the whites coming in and moving east into Ohio and the Northwest Territories, they wanted the Indians out of there. So they were just forced to move out there. They didn't have any choice, and they were loaded on railroad cars or on boats and shipped out to those places, which was the armpit of the country at that time. I mean, nobody ever thought Oklahoma would be a state, or Kansas or Arkansas. They just wanted them out of the way so the whites could, move in and take over their land. And then also during the War of 1812, a lot of the Indians sided with the British during the war under Tecumseh, the famous Indian chief. And the War of 1812 ended up a draw, so the English bailed out, and the Indians were left with no leader and, really no place to stay. So the Americans thought, we beat them, so, we don't feel bad that we're throwing them out. And which really makes me feel bad because I have a lot of Afro-American friends, and they're telling me how they were discriminated against, and I tell them that that's nothing compared to the Native Americans who were here before all of us. They were just thrown out of their homeland, and if they were given money for the land they did have, it was just pennies on the dollar. A lot of the Indians in this part of the country went up to Walpole Island in Canada, and there's still a lot of Indians up there. There's a reservation at Walpole Island.
Is that part of Canada, or is that part of the U.S.?
It's part of Canada.
Part of Canada.
Yeah.
And it's Walpole Island?
Yes, it's up by Lake St. Clair. And I was up there a few years ago and bought a couple baskets from an Indian lady up there, a Chippewa Indian.
Did you recognize any of those techniques?
They were so similar to Victoria's techniques that it was scary. Mm-hmm. And she told us that the girls of today aren't interested in making baskets anymore. So that art has pretty much died out. And a lot of these baskets this lady has made are selling for $200 and $300 on the internet. It's a rare item, and I can't imagine how much Victoria's baskets would be worth today. It would be interesting to see. So
why do you think Victoria wasn't forced out when everyone else was?
Well, I think because of her relationship to the Navarre family. I mean, they were heroes in this part of the country, and there's no way they were going to send a relative of Peter Navarre, out of this part of the country if they didn't want to go. So I think she pretty much was able to write her own ticket as far as sticking around. And then, of course, the neighbors that lived around her kind of watched over her. They made sure that she had firewood and food, and they called her Grandma Cataract because she was so dear to them. And she...
I wondered why they took such good care of her since...
well, I think that's the reason, because they
related.
Just that I read in articles where she was known as Grandmother Cataract tells me that they really cared a lot about her. And of course, she reciprocated by making these baskets for him. And I think it was just kind of a thrill to have a Native American around, you know, because all of them were gone. And it probably was a little novelty, you know, at that particular time. But
So the area that she lived is now the Chippewa Golf Course, but it
Right.
was once the farm of...
Thaddeus Taylor was the guy that owned the farm, and he owned the cabin that she lived in, and she lived in that her whole life. And in 1926, he was deceased by then, and I think his wife sold the land to a bunch of East Toledo businessmen who were going to make it a golf course. And they finished it in 1927. It was an 18-hole golf course. But it really was not good farmland. It was always used for pasture land because of the creeks going through there. There's one large creek and one small one that goes through the golf course. And it wasn't really good for farmland because of the creek bottom, so it was more or less pasture land. And for that reason, it wasn't too difficult to make it a golf course. But these fellows got together and they made it a private course for men only. Women couldn't play on it. And they were going to also start a housing development on it to help pay the mortgage off on it, or whatever they owed on it. And back at that time in 1926 and 27, they found it was too far from Toledo, and the roads weren't good enough, and the cars weren't good enough, so the people weren't interested in buying property out here. So they went into bankruptcy, and one of the owners, his daughter, bought it, and ever since then it's been golf course. It was called Chippewa Country Club to start with, and then in recent years it's Chippewa Golf Club, and they decided to name it for her because she lived on the course. And there used to be a picture of her in the clubhouse hanging over the fireplace, of her sitting in front of her log house with a basket in her lap. And so that told me right there who she was and why it was named Chippewa back when I was interested in finding out more about the Indians.
Is there anything left of her cabin?
No, that was
blocks,
pretty well gone. I talked to the first greenskeeper over there, and he said in 1927 when he started there was nothing left, but the foundation was rotted away and there really wasn't much there. And it's interesting, there was an article in the Toledo Blade shortly after she died that the Lucas County Historical Society was going to try to get a large monument on the site of her log cabin, and also mark her at her grave, because she was buried in an unmarked grave. And unfortunately, World War I came along and nothing ever happened. So she laid in an unmarked grave for 70 years until 1985. The Ottawa County Historical Society got an historic marker for her down in the cemetery where she's buried, the Crane Creek Cemetery on Billman Road. And Richard Taylor, the president of the Ottawa County Historical Society, was instrumental in getting this marker for her. And then he and I got markers for the two Indian ladies that were buried down there. I got one for Victoria, and he got one for a little girl by the name of Mary Sword that is also buried down there.
Is anything known about Mary Sword? Or?
Just that she was a little girl, and her parents must have lived around here somewhere.
Does the Crane Creek Cemetery have another name? Is that known as something else?
Not that I know of. It's because the Crane Creek goes right by it, and it's a real small country cemetery. They don't actually bury anybody in there anymore because they didn't keep very good records, and they don't know where everybody's buried. But it is a beautiful cemetery. It's right in the woods, and it's real quiet, and it's a true country cemetery. So she found a good place to be buried in.
Now, I understand she had 2 children.
Yes, she had 2 children. Peter was the oldest. He was born about 1866, according to the census records. And he was probably named for Peter Navarre, I would guess. But he married a lady in Williston in the late 1880s. Her name was Mary Danley. And they disappeared from the area he apparently went up to Pelee Island and lived up there, up in Canada, because there's no records around here, census or otherwise, of his being here after the marriage. And Catherine, her daughter, she was born somewhere between 1868 and 1870, and unfortunately she had mental problems, and her mother wasn't able to control her. And in 1890 they had to move her to the Ottawa County Infirmary at Oak Harbor because her mother just couldn't handle her anymore. And she stayed down there almost 50 years. And it was around 1942 that they had to move her to the state hospital in Toledo because she got too violent. And she passed away in 1945 and was buried at the cemetery out there where MCO is today. And when they built MCO, they dug up all the graves there and buried them at Forest Cemetery in a mass grave, so nobody knows who's buried where in that particular spot at Forest Cemetery. I do have a picture of Catherine while she was down there at the Ottawa County Infirmary, and also a lady wrote an article about her that she worked down there when she was a younger girl, and she remembered her being down there and how most of the people just kind of left her by herself. But it's pretty sad that she didn't survive, because it could have carried the family name on.
Yes. Do you know if there are any other descendants of Victoria?
Well, I was shocked. A couple of years ago, I found out that she had a great-grandson. His name was Joe Fisher, and he came out to the golf course 2 years ago. It was in the summer, and he wanted to consecrate a spot on the golf course where he thought her log cabin was. And unfortunately, I wasn't around to meet him, but I got his name and address, and I contacted him, and I mailed him a bunch of photographs and copies of things I had, which he didn't know about. And he said that he was descended from a John Cataract, which I haven't been able to make any connection with, especially because the census record in 1900 stated that she had 2 children and they were both living. And he would make 3, but you know, it's just difficult to prove one way or the other, but he was adamant about it. And then this summer we had a Victoria Cataract Day at, there's a group on the east side called the Maumee Bay Basket Weavers Guild, and they got wind of Victoria Cataract, and of course they had similar interests, and they came up with an idea that they would like to have some kind of a monument on the golf course where the site of her log cabin was. And I thought that was a pretty good idea too, and so did her great-great-grandson. So I was able to get a pretty large boulder from a neighbor, and we've got that on the spot where the cabin was, or close to it. And the Basket Weavers Guild, along with the Ottawa County Historical Society and the Genoa Grange, have financed a bronze plaque that we're going to mount on the stone, and it'll state that that was the site of her log home and who she was and where she's buried. And hopefully we'll have a dedication ceremony this spring or summer for that.
Is that site visible from the road, or is it set a little farther back?
If you're going by the golf course, heading west on 579 or Williston Road, it's the second house. And the guy's name is Don Meese, and he's a big Ohio State nut, and he's got Ohio State flags all over the place, and including site of her stone. So we'll have to say that Victoria probably would have been an Ohio State fan if
she was an original Buckeye.
If she would have been around when they were playing.
George Pearson wrote some articles about her that had some kind of cute anecdotes. I wondered if you could share some of those with us.
Oh, sure. Let's see, the first article was in July of 1914, and they were going to dedicate Peter Navarre's monument over Navarre Park, and the interviewer asked her if she was going to be going to that, and she said, goodness no, she said, I haven't done my laundry yet, and I wouldn't think of going out in public with dirty clothes. And then another interesting thing that I found out when we had a dedication ceremony in 85 at the cemetery. There was a fellow there whose a relative lived across the road from Victoria, and this little boy always had problems with getting poison ivy. And Victoria called him in her cabin, and she said, "You won't have that problem again." And she got out a jar of poison ivy leaves and told him to swallow it, and he never had trouble with it again. It was like taking a vaccine, I guess.
Over the years, other articles about her have appeared in the newspaper, haven't
Quite a
they?
few. A lot of them I've either written or people have interviewed me for. But I'm hoping somebody else will pick up the subject too, because two heads are better than one. Richard Taylor and I worked together on her project for many years, so he's really helped a lot too in this area, and we both have this common interest, history, and especially because she lives so close to where I live, and Victoria actually used to go visit Dick Taylor's grandparents, and he has baskets in the family that she gave them, so she was really a neighbor. My grandmother too, who was born in 1869 in Wood County, just over the Ottawa County line, told me one time, she said there used to be an Indian lady that went around and sold baskets to the farmers, and her name was Miss Cataract, and she never knew her first name. And I thought, gee, that's really interesting. That must tie into the lady at the golf course. And when my grandmother passed away in 1959, we were going through the house, and I was down the basement, and I was pulling out drawers, and I found this old yellow article from the Blade, and here it was on Victoria that my grandma had clipped out, and the headline was, "A woman of 1812 is failing," and it had her picture in the article, and that really got me going. And then ever since then, I've tried to save every article that I could find on her, and I did find a wealth of information at the Toledo Library, downtown Toledo, Lucas County Library, and I've been building my book up over the years. It's a 3-ring notebook binder, and I think the last time I weighed it, it's pretty close to 4 pounds. So I try to put things in the libraries around the area, so when I'm not around anymore, at least her record will be carried on. I think that's one of the joys of loving history, that you share it with other people, not only those of today, but people in the future. And so I have quite a bit that I left downtown Toledo, and also the Elmore Library, since she's lived in the Ottawa County area most of her life.
Can you tell us about her last days?
Well, according to the article that I found in the Blade, she fell in her log cabin and broke her femur and one of her legs, and they didn't find her right away, and I guess she crawled around in the log cabin, and one of the neighbors saw her crawling on the ground trying to bring firewood in, because this was in March when this happened. And once they found her, they found that she just couldn't live by herself anymore. So she also was sent to the Ottawa County Infirmary, and she passed away on March 23rd of 1915. And that's then they brought her up to the cemetery here, and she really didn't have any money. I think the Township paid for her burial, and of course she didn't have a tombstone marker, but Dick Taylor did find the record, a receipt of the grave that she was buried in, and it cost her $2 for the grave back then, in the 1880s, I believe it was, when she bought it.
Do you have any idea about how far she traveled while selling her baskets?
Well, she was a remarkable lady. I don't know how she did it, but she knew a fellow in Toledo, East Toledo, and who ran a grocery store there, and she used to walk 8 miles to the store. It was called Metzger's grocery store, and he would give her a lot of things, and I don't know how she ever got them back. She had to walk 8 miles in and 8 miles back. How she ever carried all that weight, back. And then that usually happened about once a month, according to the article. And then once a week, she used to go to Curtis, Ohio, to get supplies, and that was about 2 miles one way. So, I mean, even that is quite long for a person in their 20s, but she was in her 70s and 80s doing this stuff, and all kinds of weather too. So she was really remarkable. At one time they gave a benefit for her in Curtis. I think the church up there gave a benefit for her to help her out. But everybody in the area seemed to know about her, and I'm sure that they were already saddened when she passed away. But her memory does linger on, and I think she'll always be remembered, especially now that we're going to have this marker for her at the site of the log cabin, and she has a tombstone marker, so she's not going to be forgotten anymore.
Yeah. What does her tombstone marker read? Do you?
As I recall, it's got her name, Victoria Cataract, C. 1828, 1915, Chippewa Indian basket maker. The Chippewa Golf Club was named for her when it was formed. Words to those effect. It's a pretty good sized marker. The first one we had was smaller, and they kept knocking it off the foundation when they mowed, so I figured this is no good. I want something that's permanent, so I got a bigger one, and I had them put pins in it, so it's going to stay there for a long time. Unfortunately, the squirrels like to sit on it and shuck walnuts, and it stains the surface a little bit, but it makes it more Indian looking, more natural.
I think I read that the township also provided a little money, a small stipend for her.
I believe so. I think in the township records it indicates that they helped her out, occasionally. But I think she had her own garden, and of course the farmers around her gave her a lot of food, and I don't think she ever wanted for anything other than keeping warm. I just don't know how she ever stayed warm in a log cabin in the winters we have around here, but they were tough in those days. Tougher generation of people than we are today, especially the Indians.
Why do you think that the township would have helped support her?
Well, I don't think it was only her. I think they helped any of the needy people in the township, and she definitely was one of them. And I don't think she ever had to pay anything for her daughter's room and board down at the Ottawa County Infirmary. I think that was just part of it, that they were pretty generous back in those days too, helping people. And the costs weren't like they are today either, of course.
About how much time do you think you've devoted to? Can you estimate about how much time you spent in your research on Victoria?
Oh gosh, it's been such a labor of love that I really don't have any idea. I just, I lose all track of time when I'm working on this kind of stuff. But I know I started back when I was in high school, and that was back in the early 50s on this stuff. And it was not until about 1985 when Ottawa County put out a history book of Ottawa County and all the different townships. And Dick Taylor was asked to do a history on Allen Township where we live, and he asked me if I'd take care of Victoria Cataract. And then I really got into it. I really started researching a lot more heavily than I did, and that's when I really started finding things. And being into genealogy too for many years helped me researching her, because you go to similar sources. But it was always nice to find articles in the newspaper or talk to people who knew her, or their relatives knew her, and the different stories that have come down, over the years. She was really a remarkable lady. It's just mind-boggling how she was able to survive, but she did, and she seemed to have a happy life, and made people around her happy. So, I mean, what more can you ask?
Is there anything that I haven't asked you yet that you would like people to know about Victoria?
Oh, gosh. I'd like to know more how she was related to Joe Fisher. I really don't have too much on that yet. I've corresponded with him, and he lives up in Coldwater, Michigan, and he hasn't answered my letters lately, but I think he's down in Florida now, so. But the Fisher family, he said, was tied into the cataracts, and one of his early ancestors, a fisher, during the War of 1812. This guy was like a teenager, and the British wanted to spy the city of Detroit. So this guy got on a log and floated down the Detroit River and was able to spy for the British on what the Americans had in the way of armaments in the Detroit area.
This was a Fisher?
Joe Fisher's
ancestor,
yeah. Fisher married into the Cataract family. That's how this all happened. And but I was so happy that I was able to share this information with somebody that was a relative of hers, because I didn't think that there was anybody left, or I'd ever find anybody. And he was so elated to get all this material I sent him, and he was making copies of things, and I don't know how many different people he mailed out literature to, pictures and written material, and he didn't even know what she looked like. So it was a big surprise for him to see these photographs, and he wondered how I got all this stuff. He's telling everybody that I know more about her than he does, and I said, no, not really.
But it was mostly from this clipping that you found that
primarily. So far
interest.
I've found 13 clippings on her. 5 were in the Toledo Blade, and the rest of them were in Ottawa County papers. And it's always nice to get writings on somebody like this, shortly after it happened. But I haven't been lucky lately in the future finding anything on her, but I never give up. I'll always keep trying.
Now, you said you grew up near the area where Victoria lived. Do you still live there?
Yes. My parents built a home out at the west end of Chippewa Golf Course in '49, and that's how I got exposed to it. I was born and raised in Toledo in my early days, and it was so nice to get out in the country where we had room to run, and I loved to go over to the golf course and caddy and play golf, work in the pro shop, and I was able to talk to some of the old timers there about her to get some information on her. But it's really nice that they've carried the name on. And in December, 2 new owners purchased the course, and they're going to make a lot of improvements on it. And I made copies I did a history on Chippewa Golf Course, and I made a copy of it and give it to them. And I also included a section on Victoria, and they were just elated to have all this information. And
with your interest in history, you were not a history teacher, were you?
I always wanted to be. When I got out of high school, I thought, well, I'm going to be a history teacher. But unfortunately, I guess I don't have any patience with the kids, and it didn't pay that much back in those days. So I graduated in 1955 from high school, and so I went into the business world instead. But I've always liked history. I've really enjoyed history, and preserving it, especially, to pass it on to other generations of people. I think that's what it's all about, the sharing part of it, especially those that are interested in it. There's a lot of people that could care less, but I think it's nice to know where our roots are, and it, especially to the children. I think the children enjoy this sort of thing. I know several of them were over to the Elmore Library looking through the book I did on Victoria. They had a project to find out information on her, and that made me feel pretty good that I contributed something that they could use.
Well, I'm happy it's at the library too, and be happy to send people down to see your research. And I thank you so much for sharing your information about Victoria. She really was a very interesting person to live in this area. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me. It was an honor to talk about her and preserve her history, and I hope it'll create more interest in her and keep her legend alive. Thank you very much.